Welcome. My name is Nicole Naditz, and today we will be looking at the California World Language Content Standards. We will do this presentation in two parts so that it is easier for you to both absorb the content and also to be able to take breaks. First of all, it's important to know a little bit of information about where our standards came from. The World Language Content Standards were guided by two documents that were already in existence before our standards were written and approved in 2009. The first one was the Foreign Language Framework for California Public Schools and the Language Learning Continuum that is within that framework. The second one was the National Standards for Language Learning, developed by the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages, and the 5 C's of communication, culture, communities, comparisons, and connections that are located within that document. There are also several guiding principles of the World Language Content Standards. When the team of California World Language teachers got together to write these standards, here are some of the things they kept in mind and built into the way the document is written and structured. First of all, the document focuses on learning languages and cultures. It also emphasizes developing global competency in both English and world languages, including literacy, academic knowledge, and functional proficiency in the target language. The document also acknowledges diverse student population and sources of language acquisition. What this means is the writers of the document realized that in California, like many other states, we have students who come to us with a variety of backgrounds in the target language. Some have no knowledge at all when they first begin their language instruction, but others have a relative who speaks the language and with whom they get to speak once in a while. Other students speak another language at home all the time. Some students attend a cultural and language school after school and on weekends in order to develop or improve their proficiency. Other students had the opportunity to begin a dual immersion program in elementary school and are hoping to continue the growth of their language skills as they progress through the K-12 system. And finally, there are some students who manage to participate in a program offered sometimes by volunteers after school where they get exposure to a language, but it's not actually designed to build proficiency. So ranging from zero prior knowledge to, in some cases, extensive prior knowledge was very complex in terms of writing our standards document. And so the document writers basically wrote the document based on the stage of proficiencies in which we can find students, and by which we can define how well the students speak, write, and understand the language. Another factor that the writers considered was the fact that languages other than English are different in terms of how long it takes for English speakers to learn to speak those languages proficiently. And therefore, it wasn't possible to come up with concrete guidelines saying that every student will exit stage 1 after X hours of instruction, because in fact it takes a different amount of instruction and exposure to the language based on the difficulty of that language for English speakers. So there are 4 categories of languages. These were actually defined by the U.S. government for purposes of training their diplomats and other people who need to speak the language fluently. The first category of languages are considered the easiest for English speakers to learn. Those include American Sign Language, as well as French, Italian, Portuguese, Spanish, and other Romance languages. Students learning these languages will require less time to achieve a given level of proficiency than students acquiring languages in categories 2, 3, or 4. With each category, the amount of time required to achieve the same amount of proficiency will increase. So Category 2 languages include languages such as German and Hindi. Category 3 languages include languages such as Farsi, Filipino, Hebrew, Hmong, Latin, Punjabi, Russian, and Vietnamese. And the last category of languages, the one that will require the longest time for most American speakers of English to gain proficiency, are Arabic, Cantonese, Mandarin, and Japanese. LLC refers to the Language Learning Continuum, the document that is a piece of the foreign language framework that was already developed before our standards. It's used to indicate growth in linguistic and cultural proficiency in students, and it provides benchmarks for progress in a series of different stages of performance. We can actually really qualitatively explain what's different between stage 1 versus stage 2, 3, and 4. In stage one, students who are stage one students of a given language are at the formulaic level. In other words, they're functioning with only words or memorized chunks. These students don't yet know how to break apart those chunks and recombine them to say new things. They will struggle to do so. And in fact, even with the words they do know and the memorized chunks they do know, they will typically only be able to understand them or produce them if they are used in very predictable ways that highly mirror the ways in which they encountered them in their learning experiences. At stage two, sometimes called the created stage, students reach a hallmark because they are working with sentences. And this means that students have been able to consistently, accurately, and spontaneously break apart those memorized chunks and recombine chunks and words to make new sentences. This stage is in fact the target for students who have 4 years of world language instruction in a California high school. Because at this stage, students can communicate at a basic level on a variety of topics with which they are familiar. But these students typically are not going to be at stage 3. Stage 3 is the paragraph stage. And the paragraph stage is more than just a string of sentences put together. A paragraph, a true paragraph, is a series of sentences whose order is specific and necessary. In other words, you can't just take the sentences from a paragraph, reorder them in a new way, and have the paragraph still make sense. For most of our students, they write something that looks like a paragraph physically. However, it's not a true paragraph because it typically does not have a topic sentence. It does not have true supporting sentences or a conclusion or transition to the next paragraph. It's merely a string of sentences about their bedroom and the things in their bedroom, for example. Stage 3 is actually the level of language, or the proficiency level of language, at which native speakers hold most of their conversations. Stage 4, otherwise known as extended language, is the essay level, meaning students at this stage can both understand and produce language that is sophisticated enough to string paragraphs, true paragraphs, together in order to propose a point, justify that point, and back it up with detailed information and come to a conclusion. So I was talking in the previous slide about these stages, stages 1, 2, 3, and 4. But what is a stage exactly? Well, a stage describes the proficiency of language that a student has both for comprehension as well as for production. In order to truly define a student's stage, you actually need 5 categories of information about the student's use of language. The first one is the function, or the task that the student is trying to accomplish with the language. The second one is the context, or the setting in which the student is using this language or understanding it. Next is the text type. Is it writing a list? Is it listening to a video? Is it having a conversation orally? What type of language is being used? The next one is accuracy. How accurate is either the student's production of the language or the student's comprehension of the language? And finally, the content itself. What is the topic about which the students are communicating or about which they are reading or listening? Here's an example. A student gives advice to a classmate orally about a relationship issue, and the friend acts on the advice because they understand it. So giving advice is the function. It's the task that the student was trying to do with the language. Giving it to a classmate gives us the context. It tells us that they probably know each other and that the situation is probably informal. Orally is the text type, so they're not writing in a letter to the editor or responding to a letter to the editor. They're actually having a conversation. The relationship issue is the content, so that gives us an idea of some of the vocabulary, for example, that the students might need to use in order to do this successfully. And the fact that the friend acts on the advice or agrees with it or disagrees with it gives us a sense of the understanding that their friend has of the advice because of how well it was communicated by the student who gave it. So all of this put together gives us an idea of the stage of this activity and at which this activity is set. Expand that to determine the stage of the student. You actually need to see there are tests available to actually determine at which stage the students are consistently able to perform spontaneously and with what degree of accuracy. So although a given task might be at a certain stage, even that doesn't mean that the students are permanently in that stage. We actually have to do a series of assessments and proficiency tests in order to determine the full communicative stage of a student and have an idea of how well that student would function in a real situation with native speakers. So given all that, it is really important to consider the difference between a stage of proficiency and a level of language class. It's important not to confuse the two, because a student's course level is not synonymous with the stage of language proficiency. In other words, students who are in stage 1 are not just in year 1 exclusively. For example, French 1, German 1, Japanese 1, and so on. More importantly, however, stage 2 is not year 2. Spanish 2 students are not yet at stage 2 in the language. Most students will spend 2 to 3, and some will spend even 4 years at stage 1. And this could vary not just because of the difficulty of languages, comparative languages such as Spanish compared to Japanese, but also because of the amount of time they have to actually get instruction in the language, the setting in which the instruction occurs, how much target language is used during the instruction, whether or not they get extra exposure to instruction at home or on the weekends. There are many factors that are necessary in order for a student to move from one stage to another. So the level, of course, is merely a scheduling thing that helps schools place students into classrooms, but it actually has very little to do with their proficiency. You might have noticed this yourself as a language teacher because, as we said, students in stage 1 are at the memorized chunk level, and they have difficulty breaking apart chunks and recombining them to say new things. So think of your students who are in a year 2 or year 3 or even a year 4 class. They might have a substantial amount of vocabulary under their belt. Sometimes they can't remember all of it. But we frequently hear teachers wonder why it is that they continue to struggle with talking about what happened last week, for example, in the target language. And it's because although we might have provided instruction at it, it takes significant amount of time and practice before students can spontaneously, accurately, and consistently work at the sentence level. So although we will keep practicing, most students won't be at that level right away, and they hit up against a wall and they can't break apart those memorized chunks and recombine them. So they're in year 2 and they're in year 3, but they're still at stage 1 in terms of their actual proficiency in the language. So we do not, in fact, have grade level standards in California. There is no 9th grade French standard. There isn't even a 9th grade world language standard. And this is because, as we said, students have access to multiple points of entry into language programs and exit out of language programs, not to mention students who already are learning language outside of school entirely. Proficiency depends on previous experience with the language. Heritage language immersion schools, some students have no previous experience. It makes it very difficult for us to clarify and quantify exactly what a student should know at the end of a given grade when not all students come into the grade with the same background in the language. So we cannot have grade level standards in California. Further complicating matters is, again, the fact that there are a wide variety of languages taught in California, and the complexity of those languages differs. And as a result, what you could expect from 1 year of a Chinese course is different from what you could reasonably expect from 1 year of a Spanish course. And that does not even take into account whether a school is on block schedule or regular schedule, how many holidays there are, whether or not students do additional practice outside of the classroom, and so on. So there are no grade level standards. The standards are written by stage. The way the standards are organized then, as I said, is in 5 categories: content, the topics about which the students communicate; communication; cultures; structures; and settings. So these 5 categories make up the standards, and then within each of those 5 categories there are descriptors for the different stages of student proficiency. So there is content, a list of items for content, and then stage 1 content items, stage 2, stage 3, and stage 4. The same is true for communication. The same is true for cultures, structures, and settings. Each category contains one or more element, and that is where we will leave off for now. So please continue with the activities in the module on your website in order, and we'll see you back at part 2.